Let's do that again. Mrs. Brown Mouse and Little Brown Mouse were walking in the woods. Mrs. Brown Mouse hid behind a tree and popped out with a loud boop. Little Brown Mouse jumped and then she laughed and laughed. "Let's do that again," she cried. Not now," said Mrs. Brown Mouse, "because right now it's time to go home." So they turned around to go home, and just when Mrs. Brown Mouse wasn't expecting it, Little Brown Mouse hid among the flowers and popped out with a loud Mrs. Brown Mouse jumped and then she and Little Brown Mouse laughed and laughed. "Let's do that again," cried Little Brown Mouse. Not now," said Mrs. Brown Mouse, carrying Little Brown Mouse high on her shoulders, "because right now it's time for dinner." So they went home to make dinner, and Little Brown Mouse watched while Mrs. Brown Mouse cooked. And just when Mrs. Brown Mouse wasn't expecting it, Little Brown Mouse crept across the room and hid behind the door and jumped out with a scary "ah!" And Mrs. Brown Mouse waved her wooden spoon and growled "ah!" right back, which sent Little Brown Mouse running under the table, laughing and laughing. "Let's do that again," she cried. Not now," said Mrs. Brown Mouse, "because right now it's time to eat." So they sat down to eat, and Little Brown Mouse played with her food and Mrs. Brown Mouse ate her food. And just as she wasn't taking a rather large mouthful, Little Brown Mouse slid down behind her chair, then popped out with an eerie "Ooh!" Mrs. Brown Mouse jumped up and ran after her, crying, "What's a little ghost doing in my kitchen?" And Little Brown Mouse laughed and laughed. "Let's do that again," she cried. Not now," said Mrs. Brown Mouse, "because right now it's time for your bath." So hand in hand, Mrs. Brown Mouse and Little Brown Mouse went upstairs. And Mrs. Brown Mouse prepared Little Brown Mouse's bath, and Little Brown Mouse got in. Mrs. Brown Mouse lathered up the sponge and scrubbed Little Brown Mouse all over. And just when Mrs. Brown Mouse wasn't expecting it, Little Brown Mouse made a big splash and soaked her. Mrs. Brown Mouse shrieked and splashed her right back, and Little Brown Mouse laughed and laughed. "Let's do that again," she cried. Not now," said Mrs. Brown Mouse, "because right now it's time for bed." So Mrs. Brown Mouse toweled Little Brown Mouse dry and powdered her and tickled her toes. Little Brown Mouse laughed and laughed. Then Mrs. Brown Mouse tickled her all the way up, from her chubby little toes to her fairy little chin. "Let's do that again," Little Brown Mouse cried. "Please." Not now," said Mrs. Brown Mouse, "because right now it's time for your bedtime story." So Little Brown Mouse snuggled down under her blanket, and Mrs. Brown Mouse read her a quiet bedtime story. And when it was finished, Mrs. Brown Mouse gave Little Brown Mouse a hug. And as Little Brown Mouse hugged her back, up the stairs crept Mr. Brown Mouse. "Boo!" he cried. Mrs. Brown Mouse and Little Brown Mouse jumped, then laughed and laughed. "Shall we do that again?" said Mr. Brown Mouse. "Oh no, not now," cried Little Brown Mouse, "because right now it's time for a great big good night hug." The end.